You know this person. You ask what time it is, they tell you how the clock works. You ask if they want coffee, and somehow 4 minutes later, you know their full history with caffeine, the switch to half-caff, and what their doctor said about it at a checkup in 2019. And the thing is, they're usually sharp, often the sharpest person in the room. They're not confused by your question. They understood it fine. They just couldn't stop at the answer. We have a word for this socially. We call it a lot. We call it exhausting. We wait, patiently or not, for them to land the plane. But here's what almost nobody stops to ask. The over-explainer is almost never trying to take over the conversation. Most of the time, they are trying desperately to feel safe in it. And that one shift from annoying habit to safety strategy changes how you see the whole thing. Picture this. A kid, maybe 11, comes home with a bad grade. Not a disaster, maybe a C, but enough. The parent looks at it. There's a pause, that specific pause that a child's nervous system learns to read like incoming weather. And the kid starts talking, fast. The teacher didn't explain it the way she usually does, and I did study, but Jake kept distracting me, and I understood the first part. It was just the second section was different from the homework, and I think if I could just... Maybe the parent was actually angry. Maybe they weren't. That's almost beside the point. What matters is what got recorded. The brain logged something like, silence is dangerous. That gap before the verdict, dangerous. But words, explanation, context, reasons, those fill the gap. Those buy time. And if it worked, if the parent softened, if the tone shifted, if the outcome landed somewhere better than that pause had suggested, the brain filed it away. Cover every angle, get ahead of the interpretation, leave no gap for someone to fill in the wrong way. That kid grows up. The grades become work emails. The parents become managers and partners and people at parties. The actual threat level drops significantly. The strategy stays. Psychologists have a name for what's driving this. It's called anxiety-driven verbosity. At its core, it's a preemptive defense. The over-explainer has learned, usually early, that being misunderstood carries a real cost. So they overcorrect. They don't just answer the question you asked. They answer every version of the question, including the ones nobody asked, including the ones that might have led somewhere uncomfortable. There's also something called rejection sensitivity, a heightened alertness to any sign that someone might be judging you negatively. People with high rejection sensitivity don't just fear being wrong, they fear being perceived as being wrong, which is a different and much more exhausting problem to live with. So they get ahead of it. They add context before you ask for it. They explain their reasoning before you question it. And then there's a third layer that almost never gets mentioned. Psychologists call it cognitive overload externalizing, the tendency to think out loud rather than internally. For some people, talking isn't just how they communicate, it's genuinely how the thinking happens. They're not explaining to you, they're explaining to themselves. You just happen to be standing there. In all three cases, the pattern started the same way. More words led to better outcomes. Silence led to uncertainty. Uncertainty led to something bad. So the brain built a rule and it stuck. More explanation equals more control. Now take that and put on top of that the environments a lot of these people grew up in. Homes where the emotional temperature shifted without much warning, where the rules weren't always clear or consistent, where being misread had real consequences. Not necessarily huge ones, just frequent enough to matter. Or classrooms where giving the wrong answer in front of everyone had a social cost, where the kid who just said the wrong answer got laughed at, but the kid who gave the wrong answer with a full rationale somehow still got credit for engaging. They learned early that the explanation is armor, that laying out your reasoning, your intention, your context before anyone can question any of it isn't rambling, it's protection. And honestly, in certain environments, it wasn't even wrong. It worked. Enough times, consistently enough to become completely automatic. Here's the painful part. The strategy that protected them starts to work against them. Because over-explaining in adulthood produces the exact consequence it was built to prevent. People tune out. They interrupt. They finish the sentence before the explanation gets there. Not to be cruel, just because conversationally they lost the thread 2 detours back. And the over-explainer notices. They're hyper-attuned to exactly this kind of signal. So what do? They explain more. They backtrack. They add the context they think you missed. It's a loop, a genuinely exhausting, almost entirely invisible loop. And at the center of it, almost always, is the same kid standing in the kitchen with the bad grade. Not trying to overwhelm you, just trying to make sure you understand before you decide. But here's what the eye-rolling misses. Over-explainers are thorough. They don't half-finish things. They don't send the email without reading it back. They don't submit the work without checking it again. They are deeply self-reliant thinkers, and because they've spent so long working through their own reasoning out loud, they tend to catch things other people walk right past. They're actually good in a crisis, not because they're calm, but because they've already mentally run through 12 versions of how this could go wrong and have something ready for most of them. They care, genuinely, sometimes inconveniently, about being accurate, about being understood, about not causing harm through a careless word or an ambiguous sentence. They don't over-explain because they think you're slow. They over-explain because being misunderstood once cost them something real, and they made a quiet decision that they weren't going to let that happen again if they could help it. That's not a flaw dressed up as a strength. That is competence built directly on top of a wound. Think about someone packing for a trip. Most people throw things in a bag and figure it out when they land. The over-explainer has a list, then a backup list, then a mental note about things that aren't on either list but probably should be considered. They've thought about the weather each day, the formality of each thing on the itinerary, the chance of an unexpected dinner, the realistic possibility of the airline losing the bag entirely. Most of it will never be needed, but the one time something goes wrong, the one time there's a real problem and everyone else is scrambling, they reach in and they have exactly what's needed. They were ready. They were always ready. They just needed you to wait long enough to see it. If you recognized yourself just now, or if you recognized someone you've been quietly losing patience with, maybe this lands differently. Not as an excuse for the behavior, but as an explanation for where it actually comes from. And where something comes from matters. If this kind of thing is worth your time, subscribe. We do this every week. Take the habits that look like quirks on the surface and follow them all the way down to the root. No hype, no quick fixes, just honest psychology explained properly. Take care of yourself.